I found out on a Tuesday, which is a strange day for the ground to disappear under your feet. Most catastrophic things seem like they should happen on stormy nights or at dramatic crossroads. Not on an ordinary Tuesday in November when you're loading the dishwasher in leggings and a faded University of Michigan sweatshirt, and you hear, through the thin wall of your own house, your father-in-law's voice carrying down the hallway, with all the casual authority of a man who has never once questioned whether he deserves to take up space. "Don't bring that dirty maid into our house," he said. "My colleagues will be there." I was 39 years old. I had been cleaning houses in Naperville, Illinois for 6 years. My own company, 4 employees, a client list that included 14 households across DuPage County, a business I had built from a single classified ad and a borrowed vacuum cleaner, and enough stubbornness to outlast every person who had ever looked at what I did and decided it said something smaller than what I knew myself to be. I had been married to his son for 8 years. I had cooked in that man's kitchen and sat at his holiday table and smiled through every moment when he talked about the achievements of people who had college degrees, as though those achievements were the only kind that counted. And in 6 years of Sunday dinners and Christmas Eves and birthday parties for grandchildren I did not have, Harlan Whitfield had never once used my name when talking about me to someone else. I was Daniel's wife. I was the one who handled the house. And apparently, when it was convenient, I was the dirty maid who should not embarrass him in front of his colleagues. I stood on the other side of the wall with a coffee mug in my hand, and I did not move for exactly 4 seconds. I counted them. Then I set the mug very quietly on the counter, took my phone off the charger, and I opened the Notes app. I typed the date, the time, 7:52 in the morning, and what I had just heard, verbatim, and who had said it. I had been keeping that notes file for 4 months by then. This was entry number 31. I want to tell you this story the way it actually happened, which means I have to go back to the beginning of what I was only beginning to understand on that Tuesday morning. I have to go back to a woman named Rachel Morrow, who had been my husband's assistant at Whitfield Commercial Properties for 3 years, who had been to our house for dinner twice, who had once borrowed my phone charger at a company party and thanked me with a warmth so genuine I had believed it completely. I have to go back to the text message I saw by accident 8 weeks before that Tuesday, when Daniel left his phone face up on the kitchen island while he went to answer the door. I was not snooping. I did not even mean to read it, but the preview loaded, and the name was Rachel. And what I saw in those 2 lines of preview text was enough to understand everything I had been choosing not to see for longer than I wanted to admit. My name is Claire Whitfield, née Sorensen. I grew up in Portage, Indiana, one of 3 daughters of a woman who cleaned other people's houses for 30 years and raised us to be proud of work done honestly with your own hands, and a father who drove a truck and died when I was 22 before he got to see what I made of myself. I met Daniel Whitfield at a home and garden expo in Chicago when I was 29 and he was 33, and he was the kind of man who made you feel, in the first 20 minutes of knowing him, that you were the most interesting person in the room. He had his father's broad shoulders and his mother's careful smile, and he talked about his family's commercial real estate business, with just enough self-deprecation to seem like he wasn't impressed by it himself, which of course made you more impressed. I was running my cleaning business out of a 12-year-old Honda Civic and a storage unit in Bolingbrook. He was managing a portfolio of properties worth more than I could conceptualize. We were not an obvious match. That was part of what made it feel like something. We got married 14 months later in a ceremony at a venue in Hinsdale that his parents paid for and had strong opinions about. I wore a dress I had found at a consignment shop in Evanston, which I altered myself and which was genuinely beautiful. His mother, Patricia Whitfield, spent the reception complimenting the venue, the flowers, the catering, the string quartet, and Daniel's haircut. She did not compliment the dress. She did not, that I can recall, compliment me. What she said to me at the end of the night while Daniel was saying goodbye to his college friends was, "You're going to have to learn to move in these circles, Claire." And then she patted my hand. Once. The way you pat the hand of someone you feel sorry for. I moved in those circles for 8 years. I learned the names of Harlan's business associates and their wives' interests and their children's schools. I showed up to charity events and neighborhood association meetings and Whitfield family holidays with food I had prepared, and a smile that cost me more than anyone at that table understood. I ran my business during the day and performed being the kind of wife that family expected in the evenings and on weekends, and I was good at both, which nobody in that house gave me credit for because performing it well meant it looked effortless. That's the thing about doing something excellently that other people have decided is beneath them. They don't see the excellence. They see confirmation of their own assessment. The cleaning business had grown significantly by the time I was 35. 4 full-time employees, a dedicated business account, contracts with 2 small commercial offices in Lyle. I had a website, a 5-star average across 43 Google reviews, and a waiting list. I was not a woman struggling to get by. I was a woman who had built something real. Daniel knew this. He had signed our joint tax returns. He knew the revenue numbers. But he talked about my business the way some people talk about a hobby, with a kind of fond tolerance that implied it was sweet I had something to keep me busy. The first sign I explained away was the locked phone. Daniel had always been someone who kept his phone close, which I had understood early on as a professional habit. Commercial real estate is the kind of business where a deal can unravel between dinner and dessert, and he was always managing something. But somewhere around year 5, the phone moved from close to guarded, face down on every surface, angled away when he typed, taken into the bathroom with the same casualness that was just a little too practiced. I noticed. I filed it under stress, under a difficult quarter, under the explanation he offered when I mentioned it once, that a deal was sensitive and he couldn't risk anyone seeing details by accident. I was married to him. I believed him. Or I believed that believing him was the reasonable thing to do. The second sign was the shift in our weekends. Daniel had always traveled for work, site visits, client meetings, inspections in other states. But the weekend trips started happening more frequently in year 6, and the details became slightly less specific. He used to tell me which properties, which clients, which cities. Then it became a meeting in Indianapolis, a conference in Columbus, a site visit downstate. I asked follow-up questions the way a normal wife asks about a normal husband's normal travel, and his answers were complete enough to satisfy without being specific enough to verify. I did not, at the time, think about verification. He was my husband. We had a mortgage together, a joint account, a shared life. What I was doing, I understand now, was practicing trust the way you practice any habit, not because I examined it and chose it consciously, but because it was easier than the alternative. Rachel Morrow came into the picture as Daniel's assistant in the 5th year of our marriage. She was 26 when she started at Whitfield Commercial Properties. I met her at the company holiday party that December. Daniel introduced her as someone he'd been lucky to hire, which I remember because it was one of the few times I heard him use the word lucky in a professional context without irony. She was small and dark-haired and laughed easily. She asked me questions about my business and seemed genuinely curious, which I appreciated. We stood together near the bar for 20 minutes while Daniel talked to his father across the room. And by the end of those 20 minutes, I thought, I like her. She's real. She came to our house twice over the following years. Once for a dinner party we hosted for Daniel's professional contacts. Once for what was meant to be a casual summer gathering. Both times she was warm and engaging and treated me like someone worth talking to. Both times she left me with the impression of a woman who was good at her job and easy to be around. Both times, as I now understand it, she and Daniel had already been sleeping together for months. The text message I saw on the kitchen island that Saturday morning in September was not explicit. It did not need to be. It said, "Last night was everything. I missed you." The context of what came before was cut off by the preview limit. But last night was, everything is not a I stood in my kitchen for a moment so perfectly still that I could hear the refrigerator hum and the traffic on the street outside and the sound of my own breathing. Then Daniel came back from the door. It had been a delivery, nothing, and I handed him his phone without a word and asked if he wanted eggs. He said yes. I made them. And I did not say a single thing, because in the space of those 40 seconds between the refrigerator and the eggs, something had shifted in my chest from feeling into thinking, and thinking was going to serve me considerably better. I did not confront him. I know some people will read that and think, why not? Why didn't you ask him right then? The answer is that I already knew what he would say. I knew it the way you know the lyrics to a song you never liked. Thoroughly, involuntarily, from sheer exposure to the pattern. He would say it was nothing. He would say I had misread the preview. He would find a professional explanation so plausible and delivered with such calm that I would spend the next 3 days wondering if I had, in fact, misread it. And then nothing would change except that he would become more careful, and I would have lost my only advantage, which was that he did not know what I knew. I had watched him manage his family's perceptions of difficult things for 8 years. I understood that he was excellent at controlling a narrative once he knew one needed controlling. So I kept what I had seen to myself, and I started paying attention differently. What I noticed in the weeks after that morning would fill a longer document than this. But here is what mattered. The trips that coincided with Rachel's days off, which I confirmed by texting her under the pretense of needing Daniel's schedule for a medical appointment, she replied helpfully, checking the calendar, mentioning she was actually off that Thursday and Friday herself. The charge on the joint credit card for a restaurant in River North on a night Daniel had told me he was in Peoria for a site visit. A restaurant I found online that had a Michelin star and a prix-fixe menu, and the kind of intimacy that takes a reservation 2 weeks out. The perfume I smelled once on his jacket collar that was not mine and not masculine, and not anything I recognized from our home. I cataloged all of it. Date, time, what I observed, what he had told me. I was building something, even then, before I fully understood what I was building. The Notes app became a habit. 31 entries in 4 months. Entry number 9 was a screenshot of the credit card statement, with the River North charge highlighted. Entry number 14 was a photograph of a hotel keycard I found in the inner pocket of his garment bag. Not from Columbus, not from Indianapolis, but from a hotel in the West Loop. Entry number 23 was a recording, made on my phone left casually on the kitchen counter, of a phone call Daniel took in the next room in a lowered voice that still carried enough for me to catch. I know. I'll figure it out. She's not going to know anything. She never does. She never does. I sat with those 3 words for a long time. Not because they hurt. They did. But that was not the point. The point was that they told me exactly who I was dealing with. A man who had organized a parallel life for years and considered the organization successful because his wife had not caught him. He was not sorry. He was not conflicted. He was managing a situation, and I was the situation being managed. That was useful information. I wrote it down. And then there was Harlan. The dirty maid comment on that Tuesday morning was not the first time Daniel's father had made clear what he thought of me. It was the first time I had documentation of it. But what I had begun to understand, in those 4 months of paying attention, was that Harlan Whitfield was not a passive presence in my marriage. He had been, I now understood, actively involved in maintaining the conditions that allowed Daniel to behave the way he did. Not because Harlan knew about Rachel specifically. I don't think he did, at least not at first. But because Harlan had raised a son to understand that women like me were interchangeable, that women from places like Portage, Indiana, who cleaned other people's houses for a living, did not get to make demands of men like his son, and that the management of such women was a private affair that did not require explanation or accountability. Harlan had provided the framework. Daniel had lived inside it. I had a client named Donna Price, who had been on my roster for 4 years. A lovely woman in her 60s, recently widowed, who lived in a 12-room house in Oak Brook that she rattled around in alone and paid me very generously to keep immaculate. Donna had worked in corporate litigation for 30 years before her retirement. She was sharp, meticulous, and had what I could only describe as a finely calibrated radar for dishonesty. I had liked her from the first appointment. Over 4 years, we had drifted from professional to something closer to genuinely friendly. She left good coffee out for me and asked after my business, and once told me, in the middle of a conversation about her late husband, that the most useful thing she had ever learned in litigation was never to be more interested in keeping the peace than in knowing the truth. I called Donna on the Wednesday after the Tuesday of the dirty maid comment. Not because I planned to. I had been circling the idea of telling someone for weeks, trying to figure out who I could trust outside the social circle Daniel and his family had built around us like a very well-landscaped fence. But I dialed her number almost without deciding to, and when she picked up, I said, "Donna, I need to ask you something." And she said, "Come over. I'll make the good coffee." I sat at her kitchen table in Oak Brook for 2 hours that afternoon. I had my phone with me, and I showed her the Notes app. All 31 entries, the credit card statements, the hotel key photograph, the audio recording, the text preview I had transcribed from memory immediately after seeing it, because I understood, even in that first stunned moment, that memory is evidence only you can access, and that it needed to be somewhere permanent. Donna listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she asked, "Do you have a personal attorney, Claire? Not a shared one. Yours." I did not. All of our legal work had been done through the firm that handled Whitfield Commercial Properties, a firm that I now understood with terrible clarity was not my firm and had never been. Donna gave me the name of a woman she had worked with for 15 years, a divorce attorney in Wheaton named Sandra Ossie, whom Donna described as someone who does not lose and does not waste time. She called Sandra while I was sitting there and got me an appointment for the following Monday. Then she refilled my coffee and said, "Don't change anything yet. Don't move money. Don't change your behavior. Don't give him any reason to think you know. You need time to gather what's real." I went home and made dinner. Sandra Osi had an office on the second floor of a building on West Jefferson in Wheaton that was both unremarkable from the outside and completely serious on the inside. Clean, well-organized, with none of the decorative softness that some offices use to make difficult conversations feel more comfortable. The waiting area had 3 chairs and a small table with a plant that was genuinely healthy, which I noticed because it told me something about who managed the space. No magazines with glossy celebrity faces. No soft music designed to calm the anxiety of people who were making irreversible decisions. Just the plant, 3 chairs, and the quiet of a building where serious work was being done. Sandra was 47, compact and precise, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses she took off and set on the desk when she wanted you to understand she was being direct. She looked at my documentation for 22 minutes without speaking. Then she looked up and said, "You've done good work here. Tell me about the finances." The finances were where it got complicated, which is to say, the finances were where it got interesting. Daniel and I had a joint checking account that functioned as the household account. Mortgage, utilities, groceries, the ordinary machinery of a shared life. We each also had individual accounts, which had been his suggestion early in the marriage, presented as a practical arrangement for our separate professional expenses. My business had its own account entirely. What I had not known, what Sandra began to help me understand through a process that would take several more weeks, was that the individual account Daniel maintained, the one I had access to on paper as a named party but never monitored because he managed it, had been functioning as a second operating fund for a parallel life that I had not been part of. He was taking money from the joint account, not in large dramatic amounts, nothing that would have looked alarming in a single transaction, but consistently in transfers labeled as professional expenses, as property-related costs, as maintenance funds for the business. Over the 3 years prior to that Monday morning in Sandra's office, the total came to approximately $47,000, moved in increments of $300 to $400 at intervals of 2 to 3 weeks, to the individual account. And from there, as a forensic accountant Sandra referred me to would eventually demonstrate, to a secondary credit card I had not known existed. The secondary credit card had a billing address at the Whitfield Commercial Properties office. Daniel had been using it for hotels, restaurants, weekend trips, and in one charge that made me set down my pen when I saw it, a jewelry purchase from a boutique in Lincoln Park in the amount of $2,340, made on a date that was 4 days after our 7th wedding anniversary. I had received on our 7th anniversary a card and a dinner at a restaurant in Hinsdale. He had seemed distracted through most of it. I had told myself he was stressed about work. Sandra advised me to continue as normal, while she and the forensic accountant, a careful and methodical man named Greg Holloway from a firm in Downers Grove, completed their work. I met Greg once in person, at Sandra's office, on a rainy Wednesday afternoon in October. He was in his 50s, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of unhurried precision in everything he said that told you he was someone who had spent his career being exactly right, and understood that being exactly right was the only thing that mattered in the rooms where his work was used. He asked me about the structure of our finances, the joint account, the individual accounts, the business account, the credit cards I knew about, with a thoroughness that made me understand for the first time what it actually meant to examine a financial life. He said, "Do you have access to the joint account statements going back 3 years?" I said, "I can get them." He said, "Get them." And then he said, with a directness I appreciated, "I'm going to find things you don't expect. That's what I do. Are you prepared for that?" I said yes. He looked at me over the glasses and nodded and wrote something in his notebook. This took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of making dinner and attending a neighborhood association meeting and sitting across from Daniel at a restaurant in Naperville, for what I understood was probably the last time we would have a meal together in that configuration, the configuration of a married couple with ordinary problems. 6 weeks of watching him travel and come home and sit in our living room, watching the game and answering my questions about his day, with the smooth fluency of a man who had been doing this long enough that it required no conscious effort. He asked me once, in the 3rd week, if everything was okay. I said, "I've just been busy." He accepted this because it was an answer that allowed him to stop inquiring. He was not, I had come to understand, someone who investigated the emotional states of people around him, unless those states were creating friction that affected his own comfort. When there was no friction, he assumed there was no issue. This had probably served him very well for most of his life. I had been filing my own observations without friction for months by then, which meant he had no idea that everything around him was perfectly normal, except for the fact that his wife had consulted a divorce attorney, a forensic accountant, and a trusted friend, and had been building a legal proceeding with the methodical patience of someone who had decided that winning mattered more than the comfort of acting quickly. 6 weeks of being exactly who he assumed I was, his wife, steady and undemanding and contained, the woman he had organized his deception around because she never does, the smell of his cologne in the morning when he came downstairs ready for work, the sound of his car leaving the driveway before 7, the evenings when he arrived home and set his laptop bag on the bench in the hallway and said, "What's for dinner?" in the tone of a man who was thinking of nothing in particular. I answered, "I made the dinner." And in the back of my mind, behind everything that was visible, the documentation was complete and growing and waiting. In those 6 weeks, I also transferred, from my business account, 4 months of operating reserves into a new account in my name only at a bank in Lille where I had no prior relationship. Sandra had confirmed this was money I was entitled to. It was generated entirely by my business, built before and during the marriage with no financial contribution from Daniel, and had I not been clear about that? I was clear. I had records going back 6 years. I was also, during those 6 weeks, quietly moving the documentation I had built, copies of everything, backed up to a cloud account Daniel did not know existed, to a location Sandra could access independently if anything happened that I hadn't planned for. The holiday party was Harlan's annual event, held the first Saturday of December at the Whitfield family home in Burr Ridge, a house I had spent years visiting, a house where I had helped Patricia prepare the food more than once, and been thanked in the vague way you thank staff, a house where Harlan held court among his professional contacts like a man who had never once had to apologize for anything. It was, I understood, the event he had been referring to on that Tuesday morning when he told his son not to bring the dirty maid. It was the event where his colleagues would be present, and where appearances mattered considerably. I was going. Daniel had assumed I was going. I had never once, in 8 years, declined to attend, and I was going, but not in the way any of them had anticipated. On the Wednesday before the party, Sandra's office received the complete financial documentation from Greg Holloway, $47,280 in documented transfers, the secondary credit card account with 38 months of statements, hotel records, the jewelry purchase, charges at restaurants in the city on dates that corresponded to Daniel's supposed work travel, a charge at a florist that I did not want to spend time thinking about because I had received, in 8 years of marriage, flowers from my husband exactly twice, once when we got engaged and once when I had minor outpatient surgery. And then there was the lease. I want to pause here because the lease was the thing that even Sandra paused on when Greg's team found it. A 12-month lease, renewed twice, on a 1-bedroom apartment in Fulton Market, a neighborhood in Chicago that has become in the last several years precisely the kind of place where a certain type of man sets up a certain type of arrangement. The lease was in Daniel's name. The address on his emergency contact form at the gym he belonged to, a gym I had not known he belonged to, was the Fulton Market apartment. Not our house in Naperville, the apartment. He had, for at least 2 years, been paying rent on a space that was not our home, with money that was partly ours, and he had been bringing Rachel Morrow to that apartment on the nights and weekends and so-called work trips, when he told me he was somewhere else. Sandra was not shocked. She had been a divorce attorney for 19 years, but she did say, when she set that document on the desk between us, "This changes your position significantly." And then she said, "Are you ready to move?" I said yes. I had been ready for 6 weeks. I had been ready, if I was honest, since the morning I stood at the kitchen counter with the coffee mug and started counting seconds. Here is what I want you to understand about the Whitfield holiday party at the Burr Ridge house. It was not a casual gathering. Harlan Whitfield took his December party seriously in the way that men like Harlan take anything seriously when it reflects on them publicly, with significant effort directed entirely toward the appearance of things. There were caterers and a bartender and a string duo that played in the front room and flower arrangements that I knew, from the 1 year Patricia had mentioned it, cost nearly $3,000. There were business associates and their spouses and several people from the various professional and civic organizations Harlan belonged to. The Whitfield name in DuPage County's commercial real estate world carried weight, and Harlan cultivated that weight methodically, which meant that the people in those rooms on a December Saturday were people whose opinion of the Whitfield family mattered to Harlan in a way that very little else did. I had called the party ahead, not to warn anyone, to make a reservation of my own in a manner of speaking. I had called a woman named Betsy Chen, who handled events coordination for Harlan's firm, and who had, over the years, been unfailingly polite to me in the slightly distant way of someone who has been instructed to be polite without being told why the instruction is necessary. I told Betsy I was helping Patricia. Betsy confirmed the guest list details I needed. Then I did what I had been quietly doing for 6 weeks, which was to make sure the right pieces were in the right place. Sandra had the divorce papers filed in DuPage County Circuit Court on the Wednesday before the party. Daniel did not know. They were filed with documentation of marital assets, documented financial misconduct, and the address of the Fulton Market apartment included as evidence of the use of marital funds for an undisclosed secondary residence. A process server would reach him formally on Monday, but the papers existed. They were real. They had happened. I got dressed for the party in a way I had not gotten dressed in a long time. I wore a deep green dress I had bought in September and not worn yet. It fit exactly the way I wanted it to. And I did my hair the way I had learned to do it in the years before the marriage when I had more time and more reason to bother. I drove myself. Daniel had left an hour earlier to help his father with something, which meant that I arrived at the Burr Ridge house independently, walked up the front path in the December cold, and went inside. The party was full by the time I arrived. I recognized most of the faces. I had attended this event every year for 8 years, which meant these people knew me as Daniel's wife, which meant they considered me part of the furniture in a general way, present and inoffensive, and easy to overlook. I said hello to the people I recognized and helped myself to a glass of wine and moved through the rooms the way I had moved through rooms in that house for years, which is to say, efficiently and without calling attention to myself until the moment that I chose to. He was standing near the fireplace in the main room, Harlan Whitfield, in conversation with 2 men I did not recognize. Tall, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, wearing the kind of ease that comes from 68 years of never having been the person in a room who had to prove themselves. His back was partially to the door. He had not seen me come in. The man standing next to him, one of the 2 I hadn't recognized, looked over first. And then he did something I had not planned for, which is to say, he smiled at me. His name was Robert Calloway. He was the president of a commercial real estate development group that had done business with Whitfield Properties for years, and he was also, as I learned in the 10 seconds that followed, a client. He extended his hand and said, "Claire, I didn't know you'd be here. Donna Price speaks very highly of your service." Donna Price. My client of 4 years, the litigator with the finely calibrated radar for dishonesty, who had given me Sandra Osie's number and made the good coffee and told me never to be more interested in keeping the peace than in knowing the truth. Donna Price, who had, it turned out, a professional social circle that overlapped considerably with Harlan Whitfield's, and who had apparently mentioned my business to Robert Calloway at some point in the last year. "She cleans my house," he said to Harlan, turning to include him. "I like her a lot. She's excellent. You're lucky she's in the family." Harlan turned. He saw me. His face moved through several expressions very quickly. Surprise, recalibration, the social automatic pilot that men like him have been running their whole lives. He said, "Claire, of course." He smiled. He said something about being glad I could make it, a sentence designed to suggest he had expected me, had wanted me there, had never said anything to the contrary on any Tuesday morning of his life. Robert Calloway was still looking at me with the warmth of someone who had simply encountered a person whose work he respected. He knew nothing about dirty maids or what belonged in what house or who was and wasn't an embarrassment to whom. But I had been keeping entry 31 in my notes app for 4 days. And I had been keeping 30 entries before it. And the divorce papers were filed in DuPage County Circuit Court. And Sandra Osie had copies of $47,280 in documented transfers. And Greg Holloway had 2 years of lease payments on a Fulton Market apartment, and none of that was going back into the dark. I looked at Harlan Whitfield and I said, pleasantly, and at a volume sufficient for the immediate area, "I appreciate that, Robert. Though I should mention that Harlan was hoping I wouldn't be here tonight. Something about not wanting the dirty maid in the house with colleagues present." The silence that followed was not a dramatic movie silence. It was the specific silence of a room where several people have heard something they cannot unhear and are recalibrating in real time. Robert Calloway's expression moved from warmth to confusion to something more careful. The second man, whose name I later learned was a city council member from Burr Ridge, looked at Harlan with an attention that Harlan, visibly, was not prepared for. Harlan himself looked at me with the expression of a man who has just discovered that the furniture knows what he said about it when he thought it couldn't hear. I held his gaze for a moment. Then I said, "I'll find Daniel. Thank you for having me." I did not find Daniel immediately. I walked to the back of the house instead, to the kitchen where the caterers were working, and I stood by the window for 2 minutes with my wine and let myself feel exactly what I felt, which was a cold, complete, almost architectural satisfaction. Then I went back into the party. Daniel found me first, near the bar. He had been told something. Not everything, probably, but enough. His face had a particular quality it sometimes got when he was managing a situation he hadn't anticipated. A smoothness that was slightly too smooth. A smile that arrived a fraction of a second after it should have. He touched my arm and said, "Can we talk for a minute?" We walked to the hallway near the coat closet, private enough for what he wanted, which was to understand what had happened and neutralize it before it became anything larger. He said, "What did you say to my father's colleagues?" His voice was careful. Not angry, not yet. I said, "I quoted your father. Accurately." He said, "Claire, this is not the time or the place." I said, "I know." I said it the same way I had been saying things to him for months, evenly, without heat, with the particular tone of someone who has already made their decisions and is simply observing the current situation from a slight distance. I said, "There's something you should know." And then I told him, "Not everything. There are things you reveal." What happened in the 6 weeks after the party was the kind of thing that happens when a structure built entirely on the assumption that it will never be examined suddenly finds itself examined. The Whitfield family firm's conflict issue with Daniel's attorney was resolved, as Sandra had anticipated, with Daniel obtaining independent counsel, a decision that cost him both money and the protective buffer of his father's professional relationships. The forensic accountant's full report was incorporated into the disclosure filings. Daniel's attorney attempted, in the first week of January, to challenge the characterization of several of the transfers as marital misconduct, arguing that the business account was separate from household funds. Greg Holloway's documentation was specific enough that this argument did not survive the scrutiny. Rachel Morrow, I learned through the process, had known Daniel was married from the beginning of their involvement. This is the thing I want you to sit with for a moment because I find that people sometimes want to extend a benefit of the doubt to the other woman that the facts do not support. Rachel had attended dinner at our house. She had borrowed my phone charger. She had stood in my kitchen and asked me questions about my business with warmth that I had believed completely, and she had gone home from that dinner and continued what she was continuing with my husband. She was not an innocent party who had been deceived. She was a participant in a deception that required her to look at me and perform sincerity. She had benefited from marital funds. Greg's documentation confirmed that at least $6,000 in charges on the secondary credit card were for experiences and items involving her directly, not just the apartment or the restaurants he took her to, but specific charges on dates that corresponded to her own receipts, her own footprint in the financial record. She was not a shadow in the background of this story. She was a named participant with a documented role and documented benefit. When the details of the discovery process became known, the Fulton Market apartment, the financial documentation, the scope of what had been hidden, Rachel was not protected by her association with Daniel. If anything, that association became, very quickly, a liability. Commercial real estate is a relationship business, and the Whitfield name in DuPage County, while not destroyed, was not what it had been before the Saturday of the December party. Harlan's colleagues knew what they had heard. Robert Calloway knew what he had heard. These things move through professional circles in ways that cannot be entirely controlled, and the story of what had happened had moved in a direction that Daniel and Harlan had not managed, and could not manage after the fact, because I had made certain not to give them the chance to do so first. The version of events that reached people was not Daniel's version. It was the documented one. Rachel left Whitfield Commercial Properties in February, a departure that was described officially as mutual, but which I understood from what Sandra was able to confirm through the discovery process, was significantly less mutual than presented. Her professional reputation in the commercial real estate adjacent world of Chicago's northwest suburbs was not intact. The man she had apparently believed she was building something with was facing a divorce filing with documented financial misconduct, had lost significant standing in his professional community, and was no longer in a position to offer her the proximity to success and stability that had, evidently, been part of what the arrangement promised her. Whatever she had imagined the future looked like, it did not look like what arrived. I moved out of the Naperville house in late January into a 2-bedroom apartment in Wheaton, 4 blocks from Sandra's office. 1,200 square feet, 3rd floor, with south-facing windows that let in enough light that the space felt larger than it was. I paid the deposit from my business account, and I paid it without the particular kind of tension that comes from sharing a financial decision with someone who will have opinions about it. The property manager was a woman named Gail who showed me the unit on a Tuesday afternoon and pointed out the closet space and the in-unit washer and dryer and the way the afternoon light fell across the kitchen floor in a long stripe, and I said, "I'll take it." The words came out of my mouth before I had consciously finished deciding, which is how I knew it was right. I furnished it with things I chose entirely myself, a couch in a particular shade of green that I had wanted for years, and that Daniel would have described as too much, a dining table in natural wood with the grain still visible on the surface, plants everywhere because I had always loved plants and had kept them at the Naperville house in moderate numbers, out of a habit of moderating myself that I was done with. The second bedroom became an office for the business, with a desk I assembled myself on the first Saturday in the apartment, while a playlist I had not played in years went through the speaker I set on the windowsill. The bedroom had room for a king-size bed and nothing else, and I slept in the center of it for the first 3 nights straight through to 7 in the morning, which I had not done in longer than I could honestly remember. The 4th morning, I woke at 6:45 to the sound of light rain on the south windows and lay still for several minutes, simply registering the fact that the only schedule in the apartment was my own. The divorce was finalized in March, after 3 months of proceedings that Sandra navigated with the precision she had promised. The settlement reflected the documented financial misconduct. The $47,280 was accounted for in the asset division, which meant that my portion of the marital assets was adjusted accordingly. The Naperville house was sold. I received my share. Daniel retained the Whitfield property's interests as separate business property, which he had expected, but the division of the joint accounts, the documented transfers, and the legal costs of a contested proceeding had significantly reduced what he walked away with compared to what he had anticipated when he had assumed this would be a simpler process. The Fulton Market apartment lease was not renewed. He moved into a rental in Lysol. His father had not recovered exactly from the December party. This is the thing about social standing in a professional community built on relationships and appearances. It requires maintenance, and maintenance requires that people continue to believe in the image being maintained. What Robert Calloway heard, what the council member heard, what traveled from there to other ears in the weeks that followed, had introduced a doubt that Harlan's particular style of presence could not entirely smooth over. He was still Harlan Whitfield. He still had his business. But the room no longer responded to him the way it had, and this was a loss he understood and felt in a way that I think reached him more deeply than he would have admitted, because for men like Harlan, the room's response is not incidental. It is the point. Patricia Whitfield called me once, in February. She said she wanted to understand what had happened, and I understood her to mean she wanted to understand how much I knew and how I had known it, and whether there was anything to be done to contain it. I told her that the proceedings were in the hands of the attorneys and that I wished her well. She said, "Daniel made mistakes, Claire, but you didn't have to." And I said gently and without hostility, "I didn't have to what?" And she did not finish the sentence. There was a long pause on the line, and then she said goodbye. I have not spoken to any of them since. Donna Price took me to dinner in April at a restaurant in Oakbrook that she selected with the same care she applied to everything. A quiet Italian place where the tables were well spaced and the noise level permitted actual conversation. She was already seated when I arrived, reading something on her phone with the focused expression she had when she was genuinely interested, rather than passing time. She put the phone away the moment she saw me and said, "You look better." I said, "I feel better." She said, "I knew you would." We ordered, and she asked how the business was, practically, without the softening qualifiers that some people insert when they are being careful with someone they know has been through something difficult. She did not treat me as fragile. She treated me as someone who had executed a plan she had helped set in motion, and whose outcome she was professionally and personally interested in. I appreciated this more than I can adequately say. We finished a bottle of wine and talked about something entirely unrelated to any of it for the last hour. She had been to see an exhibition at the Art Institute, a collection she had wanted to see for 2 years and had finally gotten to, and she described it with the pleasure of someone for whom the life of the mind is not a performance, but a genuine ongoing occupation. When I drove home that night, the April air came through the window and the streets were quiet, and I thought, this is mine. This ordinary night, this drive home, it is entirely and completely mine. The business continued to grow through those months in ways that I think are not unrelated to the fact that I was no longer spending significant emotional energy on maintenance and performance and the management of someone else's narrative. The spring quarter was the strongest in the company's history. 2 new household contracts in Hinsdale, a commercial cleaning contract for a small medical office in Warrenville, and a referral from Robert Calloway himself. He called Sandra's office in February and asked if she had contact information for my business, which Sandra relayed to me with a dryness I found satisfying. I called him back, got the contract, and had it in the system by the end of the month. This is how things work when you have built something real. It continues, because it was always real. I am 40 now. I took a trip to Portugal in May, alone, 10 days, which I had never done in my adult life, going somewhere alone for that long. The idea had occurred to me once during the marriage, idly, and I had let it go because Daniel would have framed it as something strange. A wife taking a vacation alone. What was that about? Wasn't she happy at home? I had not examined his framing at the time. I had simply absorbed it, the way I had absorbed a number of things that were not actually my own conclusions, but had been offered to me often enough that I stopped distinguishing between what I thought and what I had been told to think. Lisbon, and then the Douro Valley, and then the coast. I stayed in small hotels with good beds and ate dinner alone every night at whatever time I was hungry, which is a freedom so ordinary it should not feel remarkable, and yet felt, for those first evenings, like something approaching radical. By the 4th night I had stopped being aware of eating alone as a condition, and had started being aware simply of the food, which was excellent, and the light, which in Portugal in May has a quality I don't have the right words for. Something between golden and exhausted, the light of a place that has been warm for a long time and has settled into the warmth without drama. I took photographs of the light on the river and called my mother on a Sunday afternoon from a terrace in the Douro and told her I was doing well, which she did not entirely believe until I sent her the photographs, and she texted back, "You look like yourself." I sat on that terrace with a glass of something local, and the kind of quiet that does not ask anything of you. The quiet of a place where nobody knows your name or your history, or the number of months you spent building a case in a notes app. The wine was slightly tannic and tasted like the sun on warm stone. I came home with photographs and 2 bottles of that wine, and a certainty about my own preferences that I had been quietly losing for years and had now entirely recovered. I want to tell you something about the dirty maid comment, now that I have enough distance to tell it clearly. It was not the thing that broke me. It was not even, in isolation, a particularly unusual thing for Harlan Whitfield to say. It was consistent with 8 years of how he had seen me, and how he had communicated that assessment in ways that were usually more subtle. What it was, on that Tuesday in November at 7:52 in the morning, was entry number 31. It was the moment when the pattern made itself undeniable and useful. I was not hurt by it in the way he would have imagined if he had thought about it at all. I was, in the way I had become in those 4 months of quiet documentation, simply informed. What I know now, a year past that morning, trust your own observation. Not the version of your observation that someone else has convinced you is too sensitive, too suspicious, too much. The original one. The one you had before the explanation was offered. That first clean read of the situation, the one that arrived before you started negotiating with yourself, before you decided that doubting yourself was the more mature and reasonable response. That one is usually right. I spent years practicing trust as a habit rather than a conclusion. I have the trip to Portugal, which exists in photographs on my phone and as a settled knowledge that I can go somewhere alone for 10 days and find myself entirely adequate company. I have mornings that belong to no one but me. The coffee I make exactly the way I like it. The light through the south windows. The silence that is not the silence of a house holding its breath, but the silence of a space that has been chosen freely and deliberately, that costs exactly what it costs and asks nothing beyond that. This is not a consolation. This is the thing itself. This is what I was working toward when I opened the Notes app on that Tuesday in November and typed the date and the time and the words I had just heard through the wall. Entry number 31 was the beginning of the end of something that needed to end. It was also, though I did not know it precisely then, the beginning of everything I have now. I did not forgive him. I am not going to. Not because I am still angry. I am not, or not in the way that takes up space, but because forgiveness is a transaction, and I do not know what I would receive in exchange for it, and I have become, in the past year, someone who is careful about what she exchanges and for what. What I did was something different from forgiveness. I understood what had happened. I documented it. I acted on what I knew. I protected what was mine. I walked away with what I was owed, and nothing less. That is not forgiveness. That is self-respect. And it has served me considerably better. If this story woke something in you, if at any point you thought, I know this feeling, I know that quiet that holds its breath, I know what it costs to perform a life that isn't yours, leave your comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what landed hardest. And if you know someone who is still making excuses for a person who stopped deserving them a long time ago, send them this. Because sometimes we need to see that it is possible to find out, to document, to act, to walk away with everything you're owed. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell. Here we tell stories about women who decided the truth was worth more than the comfort of not knowing. A strong hug from me. And remember this: you do not owe anyone's silence about what they did to you. Not him, not his family, not the woman who borrowed your phone charger and looked you in the eye. Not a single one of them. What you owe is to yourself, to the version of you that knew something was wrong before the explanations arrived. That original clean red that was right from the beginning. Listen to her. She's been waiting.